It was a quiet morning when the black man walked into the airport. He had a calm demeanor, dressed simply in a dark jacket and jeans. His face was serious, but there was nothing about him that stood out in a crowd. He wasn't in a uniform. He didn't look like a pilot. To the people around him, he was just another passenger. He walked through the security check smoothly, barely making a sound as he placed his things in the tray to go through the scanner. The airport staff barely glanced at him, used to seeing hundreds of travelers every day. There was nothing special about him in their eyes. Once he passed through, he headed straight to the waiting area. His flight wasn't leaving for another hour, so he decided to sit and relax. He found a seat near the window, his back straight, his hands folded on his lap. It seemed like he was trying to blend in with the crowd, but the truth was, he wasn't a regular traveler at all. The flight was headed to a distant city, and the man had been preparing for the journey for weeks. But today, he wasn't looking forward to the flight. He had been treated unfairly before, just because of how he looked. He knew people often judged him by his skin color. He had been the subject of rude comments and unfair treatment in the past. But he didn't mind. He had learned to ignore it, to not let it bother him. He had learned that people's opinions didn't matter unless they knew him personally. As he sat in the waiting area, his eyes glanced around the room. He noticed the flight attendants walking by, chatting among themselves. They didn't even look his way. Their eyes passed over him, as if he didn't exist. They were too busy with their own little world to notice him. One of the flight attendants, a young woman with blonde hair, walked by him a little too closely. She caught his gaze for a second, then quickly turned away. She gave a small, almost invisible smirk, as if she had just seen something strange. She muttered something under her breath, just loud enough for the man to hear. "Hope he behaves himself," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't react. He had heard things like that before. People often thought that because of his skin color, he would cause trouble. He wasn't angry. He was used to it. He just closed his eyes for a moment and let out a slow breath, letting the comments slide off him like water. He had faced worse. In the past, people had openly stared, pointed fingers, or made rude remarks about him. But today, he felt calm. Maybe because he knew something they didn't. Maybe because he had nothing to prove to anyone. The young flight attendant didn't stop there. A few moments later, she walked back past him, this time a little slower. She looked at him again, as if she was trying to figure him out. Her eyes scanned him from head to toe, and she gave a soft laugh to herself. She seemed to think that, just like other passengers, he would be a problem during the flight. She glanced over at her colleagues, still laughing softly, and said, "I just hope he knows how to behave on a plane." The man noticed the words, but he didn't let them get to him. He had learned how to control his emotions, to keep his face neutral and calm. He couldn't stop people from thinking what they wanted to think, but he knew the truth about himself. He stood up, stretched, and walked towards the boarding gate when his flight was called. As he passed the flight attendants, they didn't say a word. They didn't even look at him again. It was as if he was invisible. To them, he was just another passenger to take care of, someone they didn't need to worry about. The black man entered the plane, found his seat, and sat down quietly. The staff didn't give him a second glance. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to find out just how wrong they were about him. They thought he was just another passenger. But in truth, he was so much more than they could ever imagine. The black man settled into his seat as the flight took off, watching the world outside the window slowly disappear. It was a smooth start to the journey, but inside, he felt a sense of unease. He had learned over the years that some people judged others by their looks, and he knew that today wouldn't be any different. As the plane soared higher, the flight attendants moved through the aisles, checking on passengers and offering drinks. The young woman with blonde hair, who had muttered about him earlier, was now walking down the aisle with a trolley of beverages. She stopped near his seat, giving him a quick glance before speaking in a tone that was less than friendly. "What would you like to drink?" she asked, not looking directly at him, as if she were speaking to a person she barely noticed. He looked at her calmly and smiled slightly. "Water, please." She gave him a short nod, clearly not interested in making any conversation. She filled a cup with water and handed it to him without saying another word. As she turned to walk away, she muttered something under her breath, just loud enough for him to hear. "Some people just don't know how to act in public," she said, almost to herself, but he could tell it was meant for him. The man's smile faded, but he didn't say anything. He had heard it all before. He had faced rudeness from strangers countless times. Some of them didn't even try to hide their prejudice, thinking that just because of how he looked, he wasn't worthy of kindness or respect. But he had learned to let those words go in one ear and out the other. It wasn't worth getting upset over. The flight continued, and the attendants went about their duties, occasionally walking down the aisles with the same indifferent attitude. But as time passed, the black man noticed that the treatment towards him was becoming more obvious. When another attendant walked by, she glanced at him with a raised eyebrow, then quickly turned her gaze away. It was as if she was unsure about whether he should be treated the same as the other passengers. He didn't let it bother him, but he could feel their eyes on him. Every time one of the attendants came near, their gaze would quickly move away, as if they didn't want to acknowledge him. It wasn't anything new, but it still stung, even after all these years. He sat back in his seat, trying to relax, but his mind was still sharp. He knew that this kind of treatment could happen at any moment. It wasn't about him. It was about how they saw him. The color of his skin was enough to make them feel uncomfortable, as if he didn't belong in a place like this. But in his mind, he belonged everywhere. The flight attendants were busy, chatting among themselves as they moved through the aisles. The young woman from earlier was still at the front, leading the other attendants. As she came down the aisle again, she walked past him slowly. He noticed her look at him for a second before turning her head away. But this time, she didn't just walk past. She stopped right in front of his seat, standing there for a moment, as if she was waiting for him to say something. Her lips curled into a small smile, but it wasn't friendly. "You should sit up straight," she said, her voice sharp. "It's not that hard." The man's eyes flickered, but he didn't respond. He sat up a little straighter, but inside, he felt a wave of frustration. Why did it always have to be like this? Why did people feel the need to treat him differently just because of the color of his skin? The woman didn't wait for an answer. She turned away quickly, continuing down the aisle, as if she had done her job. The man let out a quiet sigh and looked out the window. He didn't know if he would ever get used to this, but he had learned to be patient. He had learned to keep his head up, no matter how others tried to bring him down. It wasn't long before another flight attendant came by. This one was a man, tall and with a friendly smile. He stopped at the man's seat, offering a drink with a kind tone. "What would you like?" he asked, genuinely trying to be helpful. The black man smiled at him, grateful for the change in attitude. "Water, please." The attendant nodded and went to get it, returning shortly. As he handed the glass to the man, he smiled again. "I hope you're enjoying your flight," he said before moving on. It was a small moment, but it meant a lot to the black man. Not all of them saw him the same way. He was reminded that there were still some people who didn't judge him, who saw him for who he truly was, not the color of his skin. But just as he finished the drink, he could already feel the shift in the atmosphere. The young flight attendant with the blonde hair walked by again. This time, she shot him a glance that was both dismissive and judgmental. Her eyes told him everything. To her, he was still just another passenger who didn't belong. The plane was flying smoothly for the first hour, with the steady hum of the engines in the background. Most of the passengers had settled in, some reading, others napping. The black man, still feeling the weight of the flight attendant's rude treatment, leaned back in his seat, trying to relax. His eyes were closed, but his mind was alert, always aware of the world around him. He could hear the soft chatter of the flight attendants as they moved through the aisles. The noise of the plane was comforting, a reminder that he was on his way, far from the worries of the past. Yet there was a small part of him that couldn't forget the way he had been treated. But, as always, he pushed those thoughts aside. He knew better than to let them take control of his emotions. Suddenly, a small shake of the plane interrupted his thoughts. He opened his eyes, glancing around. Passengers looked up, some of them frowning. The calm of the flight was quickly replaced by a sense of unease. The shake didn't feel like the usual bumps caused by minor air pockets. It was stronger, deeper. Then it happened again, a harder jolt this time, followed by a loud creak from the plane's wings. The flight attendants' faces grew tense, and some of the passengers gasped, gripping the armrests. The young blonde-haired attendant, who had been so rude to the black man earlier, quickly walked to the front of the plane, her face pale. She muttered into the intercom, trying to remain calm as she told the passengers to fasten their seatbelts. The plane shook again, this time more violently. The lights above flickered, and the hum of the engines changed pitch. People gasped. A few screamed in panic. The black man tightened his grip on the armrests, but his face remained calm. Inside, he was alert, watching everything carefully. He could tell something was wrong. This wasn't just a typical bump in the air. The turbulence was severe, and it wasn't going away. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, "we are experiencing some turbulence. Please stay in your seats and keep your seatbelts fastened. We will do our best to get through this." The announcement did little to calm the passengers. They were terrified, their eyes wide with fear. Some of them were holding on to each other, while others were silently praying. The black man's eyes were fixed ahead, but he was listening closely. He could feel the unease in the cabin, the tension that was spreading quickly. The turbulence was getting worse. The blonde flight attendant, now at the front of the plane, was speaking rapidly into her radio, her hands shaking. She was trying to reach the cockpit, but the connection was cutting in and out. Her panic was clear. As the plane shook once more, the noise of the engines grew louder, like a roar in the distance. The cabin trembled. Suddenly, another sharp jolt threw the passengers out of their seats. A few screamed, and the overhead bins popped open, dropping bags onto the aisles. The flight attendants rushed to calm the passengers, but their movements were hurried, chaotic. The man could see the fear in their eyes now. They had never expected something like this to happen. They had never seen turbulence this bad before. The black man stood up slowly, his movements steady and controlled. He didn't make a scene, but he knew what he had to do. He looked at the flight attendants, who were busy trying to reassure everyone, but they were clearly losing control. The young blonde flight attendant, seeing him get up, quickly stepped towards him. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Please sit down. It's dangerous." But the black man didn't hesitate. He walked towards the cockpit, his steps calm, his focus clear. He knew that this was the moment. The flight attendants tried to stop him, but he was already at the cockpit door, knocking once. "Let me in," he said, his voice low but firm. The attendant who was standing at the door hesitated, her eyes wide with surprise. She didn't know who this man was or why he was so confident, but the fear in her eyes told her that they didn't have much time. She stepped aside, allowing him in. The cockpit was a blur of activity. The pilots were both struggling to keep control of the plane. Their hands were on the controls, but the turbulence was making it impossible to keep the plane steady. The black man walked in calmly and stood beside the captain, looking at the instruments. He didn't say a word. He just began to assist, his hands moving expertly, adjusting the controls. The pilots looked at him, stunned at first, but they could see that he knew what he was doing. In that moment, the black man was in charge. He wasn't just a passenger anymore. He was a pilot. As the turbulence continued to shake the plane, the black man took control, guiding the pilots through the worst of it. With his calm presence and expert knowledge, he helped bring the plane back on course. Slowly, the the shaking began to subside. The noise of the engines softened. The lights flickered back to normal. The plane was no longer in danger. The black man had saved them all. The black man stood in the cockpit, his eyes focused on the instruments in front of him. The turbulence still shook the plane, but now, with his hands steady on the controls, there was a sense of calm in the chaos. The pilots, still in shock but grateful, exchanged a quick glance. They could see the man knew what he was doing. Who are you?" the captain asked, his voice a little shaky, but filled with curiosity. "I'm a pilot," the black man replied simply. His voice was calm, strong, and confident. Everything that the captain and co-pilot needed in this moment of fear. He didn't wait for a response. He just continued to adjust the controls with ease, his movements precise and practiced. The pilots, still trying to understand the situation, watched him. They had been struggling to keep the plane steady, their faces full of worry. But now, with the black man taking control, they felt a sense of relief. They had no idea who this man was or why he was on their flight, but in that moment, they didn't care. They were just thankful for his help. The man didn't waste any time. He calmly spoke to the co-pilot, giving clear instructions. "Pull back on the throttle a little. Keep your hand steady on the yoke. We need to climb higher." The co-pilot did as he was told, adjusting the throttle. The black man kept his eyes on the instruments, watching the altitude increase. The turbulence slowly began to die down as the plane reached a smoother level. The air pressure inside the cockpit changed, and the shaking became less intense. It wasn't just the pilots who were surprised by the man's actions. Outside the cockpit, the flight attendants were looking at each other in confusion. The young blonde-haired attendant who had treated him so rudely earlier was standing by the door, her eyes wide in disbelief. She had never seen anything like this. The man, the one they had all ignored and underestimated, was now saving them all. The black man had taken charge, and they could see it. He wasn't just helping. They were all depending on him now. He glanced over at the flight attendants as he spoke. "Tell the passengers to remain calm. We're going to make it through this." The blonde-haired attendant nodded quickly, her voice shaking as she spoke into the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some turbulence, but the situation is under control. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The passengers, some still frightened, began to calm down. A few of them looked up at the flight attendants for reassurance, and when they saw the serious yet calm expressions on their faces, they began to relax. The fear in the cabin started to fade. Back in the cockpit, the black man continued to guide the pilots. The co-pilot, who had been tense moments ago, now followed his instructions with more confidence. The captain, who had been unsure of the man's abilities at first, now saw him as a lifeline. The black man's expertise was undeniable. "We're almost through the worst of it," the black man said, his eyes never leaving the instruments in front of him. His hands moved swiftly, but with precision, adjusting the flight controls as needed. "Just stay focused." The co-pilot nodded, his breathing slow and steady now. He could feel the turbulence easing up, and with the black man's help, he knew they were going to be fine. The blonde-haired attendant, still watching from the door, couldn't believe what she was seeing. She had judged the black man so harshly earlier. She had assumed he was just another passenger, someone who didn't belong. But now, watching him take charge, she felt a wave of embarrassment wash over her. She had been wrong, so wrong. As the plane continued on its path, the black man's calm presence brought an air of control that the pilots had needed. The turbulence that had shaken the plane for so long finally started to subside. The plane leveled out, the shaking stopped, and the smooth hum of the engines returned. The flight attendants began moving down the aisles again, this time with more confidence. The blonde-haired attendant walked slowly toward the cockpit door, her heart racing as she tried to process everything that had just happened. When she reached the door, she looked at the black man. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft and sincere. I didn't know who you were, but I should have treated you better." The black man gave her a small smile. It's okay. Just remember, it's not about how someone looks. It's about who they are. With those words, the blonde-haired attendant nodded and walked back to her post. She knew she would never forget this moment. The man who had been ignored, treated with rudeness, had just saved their lives. He wasn't just a passenger. He was a hero. The plane had finally settled into a smooth ride after what felt like hours of terrifying turbulence. The loud hum of the engines returned, steady and calming. But the passengers were still on edge, some looking nervously out the windows, others clutching the armrests tightly. They were all too aware of how close they had come to disaster. And yet, they didn't know who had truly saved them. The black man, now calm and composed, sat in the cockpit, his hands still on the controls. The captain and co-pilot, now relaxed but still alert, watched him with a mix of respect and gratitude. They had followed his lead, and in doing so, they had helped steer the plane out of danger. "Thank you," the captain finally said, his voice full of awe. "I don't know what would have happened without you." The black man nodded, his expression steady. "You're welcome. We just had to stay calm and get through it." The co-pilot, who had been gripping his seat during the turbulence, now smiled at him. "You're incredible. I don't think we would have made it if you hadn't stepped in." He didn't say anything in reply. He didn't need to. He had done his job. The plane was safe now, and the passengers were no longer in danger. He had saved the day, and that was all that mattered. Outside the cockpit, the flight attendants were beginning to move again. The young blonde-haired woman, who had treated the black man so poorly earlier, was walking down the aisle, her face now filled with respect. As she passed the passengers, she spoke softly to each one, reassuring them that they were fine. But her eyes kept darting back to the cockpit, where the black man had just proven himself to be their hero. The passengers were beginning to realize what had happened. Some of them had witnessed the black man's calm actions during the turbulence. Others had simply heard the captain's voice over the intercom, thanking the mysterious passenger for his help. But everyone on board knew one thing for sure: the black man had saved their lives. One passenger, a woman sitting near the front, leaned over to her seatmate, her voice low. "Did you hear? That man in the cockpit, the one who helped, he's a pilot. He saved us all." Her seatmate, who had been staring at the cockpit door in disbelief, nodded slowly. "I can't believe it. The way he took control, like he knew exactly what to do. I thought we were done for." But they weren't done for. They were safe, thanks to the black man who had taken charge. Back in the cockpit, the captain turned to the black man once more. "You've done more than I could have ever expected," he said, his voice steady but filled with gratitude. "I didn't know you were a pilot. Where did you learn to fly?" The black man paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the instruments in front of him. "I've been flying for years," he said quietly. "It's what I do." The captain and co-pilot exchanged a look. They had no idea who this man was or how he had ended up on their flight, but they knew one thing. He was a professional, a skilled pilot who had just saved the day. Outside the cockpit, the flight attendants were still moving through the cabin, but now there was a different energy in the air. The tension had lifted, replaced by a quiet sense of relief. People were talking to each other more freely, their voices no longer filled with fear. They were safe, and they had the black man to thank for it. The blonde-haired attendant, who had been the first to treat him with suspicion, was now standing near the cockpit, waiting for the chance to speak with him. She felt a wave of shame wash over her. She had judged him too quickly, dismissed him as just another passenger. But now she saw him for who he really was, a hero. When the black man finally exited the cockpit, she took a deep breath and approached him. This time, there was no rudeness in her voice. There was only respect. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly, her eyes meeting his. "You saved us all, and I should have treated you better from the start. Thank you." The black man looked at her for a moment, his face unreadable. Then, he nodded slowly. "It's okay. Just remember to treat people with respect, no matter who they are." Her face softened, and she smiled at him. "I will. I promise." As the flight continued on its way, the mood in the cabin had shifted. The passengers, once anxious and fearful, were now calm and grateful. They had faced a terrifying moment together, but they had survived. And they knew it was all thanks to one man who had taken charge when it mattered most. The black man returned to his seat, his face calm as ever. He didn't need any praise. The job was done. He had saved the day, and that was all that mattered. The rest of the flight continued without incident, the turbulence now a distant memory. The hum of the engines was soothing, and the passengers, though still shaken, had begun to relax. Many of them now looked at the black man with newfound respect. It was clear that he had been the calm in the storm, the one who had kept them all safe. But there was still one thing left to be done, the apology that had been long overdue. As the flight neared its final descent, the young blonde-haired flight attendant, who had been so rude to him at the start, was standing near the cockpit door again. She had tried to avoid looking at the black man earlier, but now she couldn't ignore the weight of what had happened. She had been wrong about him. She had judged him without knowing anything about who he truly was. Her heart raced as she thought about it. How had she been so careless? She had treated him like an outsider, assuming he didn't belong. She had been so quick to dismiss him, but now she knew the truth. He was not just any passenger. He was a hero, and heroes deserved respect. She glanced nervously at her colleagues, then walked toward him. He was sitting in his seat, staring out the window, his expression calm and collected. He didn't seem angry, didn't seem upset, but she knew he deserved an apology. Taking a deep breath, the blonde-haired attendant stopped in front of his seat. The noise of the plane and the voices of the other passengers seemed to fade away. It was just the two of them now. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice shaking slightly. The black man turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice polite but distant. The attendant swallowed, her nerves getting the better of her. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I was wrong to treat you the way I did earlier. I judged you without knowing anything about you. I didn't realize who you really were, and I'm really sorry for that." The black man looked at her for a moment, his eyes steady, as if weighing her words. He had heard apologies before, but this one felt different. It wasn't just a polite apology, it was sincere. "You don't need to apologize," he said quietly. "You didn't know who I was, and I understand that. But I think we all learned something today, didn't we?" The blonde-haired attendant nodded, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. She had been worried he wouldn't accept her apology, but his calm response made her feel better. She didn't know if she would ever be able to fully make up for what she had done, but at least she was taking the first step. "I learned a lot today," she admitted. "I learned not to judge people based on how they look or where they sit. I learned that sometimes the person you least expect is the one who can save the day." The black man nodded slowly. "We all have our lessons to learn. It's just important that we learn them and do better next time." His words struck a chord with the young attendant. She had heard many people say things like that before, but something about the way he said it, so calm and wise, made it feel real. The passengers, unaware of the quiet exchange, continued on with their conversations. But to the black man and the flight attendant, this was the moment that mattered. This was the apology that needed to happen. "I'll make sure I treat everyone with more respect from now on," she promised, her voice strong now, filled with determination. The black man smiled, a small, understanding smile. "I'm sure you will." With that, the attendant turned and walked back down the aisle, feeling lighter than she had in hours. She knew she had done the right thing. As she passed the passengers, she saw them looking at her with curiosity, but her mind was on something else. She was thinking about what the black man had said. It's not about how someone looks, it's about who they are. When the plane finally touched down and the passengers started to gather their things, there was a sense of gratitude in the air. People spoke quietly, exchanging stories about the terrifying turbulence and how the black man had stepped in to save them. Many of them would never forget the calm, strong figure who had kept them safe. For the blonde-haired attendant, the day would be remembered for more than just the flight. It would be remembered as the day she learned a valuable lesson about judgment, respect, and humility. And it was all thanks to the black man who had saved them all. The plane had safely landed at the airport, and the passengers began to gather their things, slowly making their way off the aircraft. The mood in the cabin was much different now than it had been earlier. The fear and anxiety that had gripped them during the turbulence had disappeared, replaced with a quiet sense of relief and gratitude. But for the blonde-haired flight attendant, the day had not just been about a smooth landing. It had been about learning a lesson she would never forget. She had gone from looking down on the black man to realizing that he was the very reason they were all alive. She couldn't help but think about how wrong she had been, how quickly she had judged him based on his appearance, not knowing the truth of who he was. She couldn't shake the thought of his calm, confident presence in the cockpit, taking control when everyone else was frozen in fear. He had saved them all. And now, as the passengers began to exit the plane, she knew she had to do one last thing. She spotted him standing near the exit, speaking to the captain. She could see the two of them laughing quietly, sharing a moment of relief after the tension had passed. The captain had thanked him multiple times, but it seemed the black man was just glad to help. He wasn't looking for praise. He had done his job, and now it was over. The blonde-haired attendant took a deep breath and walked toward him. Her heart was beating faster than she wanted it to. She had already apologized, but she needed to do more. She needed him to know how much she truly appreciated what he had done. When she reached him, she hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say. But then, she remembered his words from earlier. It's not about how someone looks. It's about who they are. She realized that was the key. It wasn't about making up for her mistake. It was about showing him she had truly learned from it. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice steady. The black man turned toward her with a small smile, as though he had been expecting her. "I just wanted to thank you again," she began, her eyes meeting his. "Not just for saving all of us, but for showing me something I didn't see before. I judged you, and I was wrong. I'm sorry for that." The black man nodded, his smile never fading. "I understand. It happens. What matters is that you learned from it." She looked at him with respect in her eyes now, no longer the nervous young woman who had treated him with suspicion. "I've learned a lot today," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. "I've learned not to judge people by how they look or where they're sitting. I've learned that anyone can be a hero if they have the right skills and heart. And most of all, I've learned to never make assumptions about anyone ever again." He nodded again, his eyes warm. "That's a good lesson. One that everyone should learn." The flight attendant felt a weight lift from her chest. She knew she had done the right thing, both by apologizing and by truly understanding what had happened. It wasn't about feeling guilty for her actions. It was about becoming better. And that was something she would carry with her always. As the last few passengers exited the plane, the black man turned toward the gate. The flight attendant watched him for a moment before turning to rejoin her team. She felt a sense of calm inside her, a quiet satisfaction that she had made the situation right. The airport was bustling with people, but for her, everything felt slower, more deliberate. She had learned the most important lesson of all. People were more than just their appearance, their clothes, or the color of their skin. They were defined by their actions and their character. The black man, who had been ignored and dismissed, had proven that. As the crew began their final preparations for the next flight, the blonde-haired attendant looked back toward the door. The black man was no longer a stranger to her. He was someone who had taught her more than she could ever have imagined. And as for him, he didn't need any special recognition. He had done what needed to be done, and that was enough for him. He had saved the day, and in doing so, he had changed one person's life forever.